Hi, this is an introduction to working with Blender. It's not a particularly in-depth tutorial, but just to give an overview of some of the functions, and just so it's not quite so bewildering when you open it for the first time. It's aimed in part at people wanting to work with Blender for physical sculptural purposes, whether that's 3D printing or I have Digital Stone Project in mind as I am recording this tutorial. Okay, so this is what you should be faced with when you open up Blender. I'll leave a link to the download in the description. I would recommend learning and potentially working with Blender using a full Numpad keyboard, as in a keyboard with the calculator style numbers on the right hand side and a mouse with 2 buttons and a clickable scroll wheel. I know most laptops do not have the numpad on the side, and your mileage may vary with trackpads depending on what machine you use as to how good that is for navigating in Blender. I use a mix of a graphics tablet and an Apple mouse, but I find the numpad keyboard especially useful, but I will talk in a bit about how to sidestep that if you don't have a numpad or a mouse. So if we click away from that title screen, you should have 3 objects in your scene. So to start with, we're going to just learn how to select different objects in our scene, and that's just using left click. And you can see, if you look on the right here, we've got an outline of whatever's in our scene, and that's our camera, this is our default cube, and this is a lamp. The next thing we're going to learn is how to orbit around our scene. So using your mouse and clicking on a scroll wheel, you can see if I click and drag, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on my screencast keys so you can see in this bottom left corner what I'm pressing on my mouse and also what keys I'm typing. Okay, so again, clicking the scroll wheel of your mouse will move your scene around the selection. And then the next thing we're going to learn is holding Shift, and that's the up arrow button on your keyboard. Holding it down and clicking the mouse wheel will pan your view from left to right. And that's slightly different from the orbiting where it spins around, and holding Shift pans our view from left to right, perpendicular to our view of the screen. And then the next thing is zooming in. We can do that with the scroll wheel. And there are, in Blender, there's usually at least a few different ways of doing every single function. So you can also use plus minus on your numpad keyboard to zoom in and out, which I sometimes use. The next thing is our numpad. So now I'm just going to do a little aside to anyone who doesn't have a numpad keyboard. So we're going to go to Edit, Preferences, and you can also get there by pressing Command and comma, or that will be Control and comma if you're on a Windows. And if we jump to Input, and we've got this key here, which is Emulate Numpad. So what that means is if you don't have a numpad and you have this checked, you can see that now tapping on the top row of numbers will have the same effect as the numpad. But there is a sort of a logic to having the numbers laid out on a numpad, and actually the top numbers on your keyboard have can serve a different function. So I'm just going to go back in and turn that off. Now a note for anyone who wants to work on a trackpad without a mouse. Again, I would recommend working with a mouse, but if you are just on a laptop, we're going to go back into Edit Preferences, and this time we're going to do Emulate 3-button mouse. So with that selected, if we hold down Alt and we left click, you can see that is a different way of orbiting around our scene. And then similarly, if we hold down Alt and Shift and left click, we pan our view. And depending on your trackpad, how effective 2-finger pinch to zoom in and out, and you can actually, on some trackpads, I'm using an Apple one here, I'm using 2 fingers to orbit around my scene as well, and I could just hold Shift with the 2-finger swipe, but it does vary depending on your laptop. Okay, but I'm going to be using a mouse, so I'm just going to go back in and turn off the emulate free button mouse. The next thing we're going to look at is the different functions on the numpad. So 5 in the middle, it turns our perspective on and off, so I'm just going to tap that first. So we're in a non-perspective mode, and 1 is front view, 3 is side view. Now we can already see that the problem here is we're looking at a cube from different views, so that's no good. So I'm going to click our cube and I'm going to tap X, and that brings up our delete menu, and we're just going to delete that. So now I'm going to go to Shift and A, which brings up our add menu. Again, I like using keyboard shortcuts, it keeps things quick and efficient, but most things you can do with a keyboard or a mouse, there are also menu versions of these things. So the Shift A add menu is also found at the top here, but I'm just going to go Shift A, and we're going to go, we've got all these different things we can add to our scene, but for now we just want to go to Mesh, and we're going to add the Blender monkey. So now if I tap 1, we can see we're in front view, 3 on our numpad is side view, 7 is top view, 9 is bottom view, and 2 and 8 scroll over and under, and 4 and 6 rotate left and right. Okay, and again 5 jumps between orthographic and perspective mode. So it's just when you're modelling, it can be useful to work in either of these view modes. Okay, so the next thing we're going to quickly learn is 3 very basic functions. We want to be able to move, rotate and scale our objects. So instead of M for move, I'm going to tap G for grab, is the way I remember it. And if I tap G with the monkey selected, you can see that when I move my mouse, it moves our object. So this is different from changing our view of the scene. This is actually moving the object relative to the scene. Since we're working 3D, everything relates to X, Y, and Z coordinates. So you've got a little icon here which lets you know which direction is which. For some reason, Blender chooses to have Y as the in out and Z as the up down, but I've just kind of gotten used to that. I think you can change that, but we're going to keep it as it is for now. Okay, so if I tap G, you don't need to hold it down, just press it once. If we move our mouse, it moves it freely, but if I then tap X, you can see we then constrain our movement to the X-axis. And similarly, I can just tap to Y, and then we are only grabbing in the Y-axis, and similarly with Z. Okay, a very important thing is the ability to undo. So Control and Z, we'll just put our monkey back at the middle. Okay, so the next thing is rotation. Again, if we just tap R, we have a rotation relative to our view of the screen. So if I was in front view, it would just rotate it straight on, but if I'm rotating an angle, it's rotating it relative to our view of it. And again, R and followed by X will rotate in the X-axis, the Y-axis, and tapping Z, the Z-axis. And similarly, S for scale. Again, if we just tap S by itself, it will scale the whole thing. And I've just pressed escape, which can cancel an action. So now if I tap S and X, you can see I scale it in the X-axis, then the Y-axis, and the Z-axis. You can do any combination of rotating and grabbing in the various axes, just to practice that. And we're going to undo a few times. So we have monkey back in the middle. And another way of actioning the grab, scale and rotate functions is using these icons on the side. So you can see we've got the move handles, the rotation handles, and the scale. And you've also got this, which is probably the most useful, which has all 3 of them. So that's another way of being able to scale, rotate and move your object. Some people prefer to use this transform controller, but personally I'm used to using my keyboard shortcuts. Okay, and what we're going to have a look at now is this cursor. So this will tell Blender if we're adding an object, and it has various other uses which we'll come to in a bit, where we want to add an object. With this crosshair selected, I can click anywhere in the scene, and now if I add an object, so we can do a cube, add a cylinder there, and let's go with a cone. Personally, I like to be able to select my objects all the time, so going back to our selection icon there, it means we can select our objects. So I'm just going to grab the monkey and move her out of the way. Now, if you want to keep your select box selected and you want to drop a crosshair, what you can do is hold down Shift and right click, and you will drop the 3D cursor. So now we've got a few objects added to our scene. To add to our selection, so far we've just got Suzanne, as she's called, the one object selected. If we want to work with a few objects at the same time, I can hold down Shift and click Select, and I've got all these 4 objects now added. So now, if we wanted to rotate all of these things, you can see if I just tap R, as before, I can rotate them all in the various axes, or all together around their sort of median point, which is the center point. However, there are also different ways of working with multiple objects. So we can go to original origins, and then they will all rotate around their original origins. And again, you can do that in the various axes. The median point is what we've defaulted to. 3D cursor is the other one that is useful. And you can see that with that we can drop our 3D cursor and the objects will rotate relative to that. The next thing we're going to learn is how to go back to our default scene. So Control and N will bring up the new file dialog, and we just want general. And I guess I should also mention first that if you want to save at any point, you can go to File, Save, or Save As, or Control S, or Control Shift and S does the same thing. Okay, so let's just get rid of all this and let's start with a new file. So I'm going to do Control and N. I don't need to save that, and we start with our default scene. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at, if you look at the top left here, we've got our different modes. So far we've been in object mode. That's our way of working with objects as a whole, but in edit mode, so if I click on the object mode here and jump down to edit mode, and that shows, I'm just zooming in a little bit, and then we can see what the geometry our object is made of. Another useful thing here is toggling X-ray. So if I click on that, you can see it makes our object kind of transparent, so you can see all the different vertices that make up our cube. Okay, so as before, left click selects, in this case, our different vertices. Vertices are the different points that make up our objects. And there are different ways you can select and work with geometry. So this is vertex mode. We can also go to edge select mode, and instead of individual points, we can work with an edge, which is any line between 2 vertices, and finally face select mode, which is any surface made by any more than 3 vertices. And quite useful, which is why one of the reasons I like to keep my numpad for navigating and my top number keys free, is you can jump between vertex select mode with 1, edge select with 2, and face select with 3. And let's just work with something a bit more interesting than a cube for now. So I'm just going to delete the cube, Shift and A. And I should mention actually that if your 3D cursor isn't in the middle and you want it there, there's a couple of ways we can do that. So Shift and C will centralize our view of the scene, but also drop the 3D cursor in the middle. Also, if I tap on N, you'll get the menu options down the side here. And if I go to view, you can see the location of the 3D cursor is there, so you can actually precisely control the location of the 3D cursor as well. And N just hides and reveals that menu. And similarly on this side, we've got some of our tools. T hides and reveals those if you need to. Okay, so with our 3D cursor in the middle, let's just add Suzanne the monkey again, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And if we tab into edit mode, and I'm going to jump to vertex select mode, you can see holding down shift will add to our selection. And again, I can do my usual grabbing and selecting, and you might just want to experiment with how that works, depending on whether you're working with edges, vertices, or faces. And just a little exercise now to go over what we've learned so far, but also to learn a couple of new things. Let's start with a new scene, so Control and N, and we'll end up with our default cube in the middle. So what we're going to do now is make a very simple car vehicle. And so with our cube in object mode, we want to jump to edit mode, which we can access from this top menu here, but also I always use the keyboard shortcut, which is tab, and we jump straight to edit mode. And I'm going to turn my X-ray back on, which I think might be useful for this. Okay, so the next thing we're going to learn is how to do a loop cut. So if we do Control, hold down Control and tap R, and we don't have to hold anything down after that, you can see this gives us the option to place a loop cut, which will add some new geometry to our object, so we have more vertices to work with. So I'm going to put one in this horizontal direction. So if I left click once, you can see I then have the choice to place it anywhere. If you wanted it straight in the middle, you could tap 0. It doesn't matter too much, but let's just go with right in the middle. And so now you can see we've added a loop cut, which has added some more geometry around our cube. I'm just going to undo that. Okay, so the next thing we're going to learn is how to extrude. So I'm going to jump to face select mode. I could have tapped 3, and I'm going to left click this front face, and you might just want to reorientate yourself to make sure you know which is front. So I'm going to just tap 1, and I can see that's the front, the lower front face, and I'm going to E for extrude. And you can see we've created a new chunk of geometry to work with, and I'm going to do the same on the back. Left click, select this back face, and E for extrude, and drag that out. Now you can do this precisely by entering figures. So if you look around this top left area here, if I were to tap E, you can see there's a number. So I could, if I wanted to work with a blend of geometry, I could press E and then tap 3, and then it would extrude it 3 blender units. I'm going to grab that in the y-axis and just make it a little bit smaller, just so you know that you can do all of these things very precisely with precise measurements. Okay, so it's already beginning to look a little bit like a car. What we want to do now is add some space for the wheels. So I'm going to do some more loop cuts. This time I'm going to do Control and R, but we want more than one loop cut. I think we want 4 going down the front. And then again, if I left click, I can place it anywhere, but I do want them right in the middle, so I'm going to tap 0 and press enter. I'm going to do 3 loop cuts going in the other direction in the front. And it doesn't matter too much, but I want to put them in the middle with a 0, and Control and R, tap 3, left click, and put them in the middle. So now I'm just going to turn off the X-ray view, and you can see the shortcut is often displayed, but not always when you hover over a tool. So I can just do Alt or Option Z to toggle between the two. Okay, so let's make sure we're in face select mode, and I'm going to shift select these 2 faces here, and then similarly on the back, the corresponding faces there. And if I G for grab, and I want to limit this to the Z axis, so I'll tap G and then tap Z, and if I move my mouse, it moves those 4 faces up, and you can see we've got pretty basic space for some wheels. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at, I'm going to jump to vertex select mode with typing 1, and it's a different way of placing our 3D cursor, but also a menu that will enable us to move things to specific places. But for now, I'm just going to click this front vertex and the one behind it, and if I do Shift and S, we get the selection menu. Some of these are quite useful, but for now we just want to put our 3D cursor to our selected, and because there's two things selected, it will place the 3D cursor right in the middle of those two vertices. So now if we go to Shift and A, which is also our add menu in edit mode as it was in object mode, this means we are adding different mesh items within our mesh that we're working on. So I'm going to add a circle. We could technically do a cylinder, but for now I just want to reiterate the extrude. So we're going to tap on circle, and you can see there's this little menu here. If we click on that, it will give us some options for the circle we've just made. We can just leave a lot of that as it is, but the one thing we want to add, because at the moment it's just a circle without any filling, and we could actually control the size of it. So actually let's do that while we're here. Let's make the wheel a bit smaller. You can just do it by dragging it, or you can put a precise number in, and we're going to do fill type as triangle fan, and so basically that just adds a load of triangles to fill up our circle. Okay, and then we want to rotate that in the y-axis by 90 degrees, so, and press enter. So what I've done there, I'll just undo that, is I've tapped R, then Y, and then typed in 90 on either set of your number keys. Okay, and then I want to E for extrude to give some depth to our wheel. Okay, the next thing we're going to learn is how to select all in edit mode and object mode. That would just select all your objects or none of your objects, but in edit mode, if I tap A, everything is selected within our object, and if I do Alt and A, it deselects everything. And another useful way of selecting items within your object is if you hover over part of a mesh and tap L, it will just select the part that you've hovered over. So that's kind of useful. Okay, so I'm just going to do this roughly for now. With the front wheel selected, let's just turn off perspective mode with 5 on your numpad. I'm going to shift, oh actually let's just scale that down a little bit first, because we're going to now duplicate our wheel, and I'm going to hold down shift and D, and this is to duplicate, and you can see if I move the mouse away it's duplicated the thing, but we want to constrain that to the y-axis, and I'm just going to quite roughly for now place that in the equivalent place at the back. And then if I hover over the front wheel, now deselected with L, that will also select that. If I jump to front view, I'm going to Shift D, select, and I want to constrain that to the x-axis this time. Now, of course, there's many different ways you could achieve having the 4 wheels repeated, and some ways that are a lot more precise, but for now, that will do. Okay, so now what I would suggest you do is just spend a few minutes pimping your ride, I guess. So, oh, I didn't mention that. So if you click and drag, you create a bounding box for selection, and if you hold down this, you've got different ways of selecting vertices or objects depending on what mode you're in. I tend to keep it at either select box or select lasso. And you can see the lasso is just a different way of selecting the vertices you want. But I'm just going to keep it at select box for now, and Alt A to deselect everything. And I'm just going to spend a bit of time adding some loop cuts, selecting different vertices, grabbing them in different axes, holding down shifts to add to my selection. I'm going to grab that in the y-axis, and just have a bit of fun modifying your vehicle. And again, just to remind you that you've got this transform controller, which you might find useful when you're 3D modelling. Going to jump to face select. And I should mention also that depending on whether or not you're in X-ray mode, only select things that are visible to you, or in X-ray select mode, you can see I can use the X-ray to select things outside of my view. Okay, so with X-ray off, if I just select all of those, it will not select any of the faces on the other side. I'll grab Z-axis, grab the Y-axis, and I'm just sort of making this up as I go along, really. Oh, and I should also mention that if you hold down Shift and you click on vertices, faces, or edges, you will also take away from that selection as well as adding to them. Grabbing the Z, against Control R, add a loop cut around this edge. E for extrude, and actually it can be useful to use our pivot point from before. So if I were to scale these two objects now, it would scale them relative to each other, but we may want them to scale independent of each other. So again, individual origins is useful, and we can scale each face relative to itself. I think that's the worst car I've ever made. Anyway, just to reiterate some of those functions, and especially E for extrude and Control R to create a loop cut, and various ways of working with your mesh. Okay, I don't think I'm going to say that. Maybe I'll need to refer to it. Okay, so again, let's move on to our next exercise, and I'm going to do Control and N and start with a new file. Okay, so we're going to make a really rough character this time, again to learn a few new things and to reiterate some of the things we've learned before. Okay, so with our default cube selected, let's think about making this into a little character. So we're going to tab into edit mode, jump to face select mode, and left click select this underside face. I'm going to E for extrude, but I don't want to move it, so I'm just going to press enter without moving my mouse. It doesn't matter too much at all if it moved it a little bit, and I'm going to scale that in, and what I'm aiming for is the beginnings of a head. I'm just going to get rid of this grid floor, sometimes useful, just distracting me a little bit. So if you look at this little menu here, we've got a load of our view options, and I'm just going to turn off the floor. I'll keep the X and Y axes visible. Okay, so now with our bottom face selected, I'm just going to E for extrude, and we make a little neck, and I'm going to extrude again, just move it down a little bit, and I'm going to scale it just a bit outwards, and then I want to scale it just in the X axis. So I'll tap S, then tap X. Oh, and I'm going to move out to create the sort of shoulder area. And if you ever make a mistake, just remember to don't keep trying to go over what you've just done. Just do a Control Z and rework it. Okay, and then I'm going to E for extrude and drag that down. It really doesn't matter for now, the proportions. And you can see that I've got the beginnings of a very basic geometric head and body. Now we're going to think about arms and legs. So obviously it makes sense to not have to do everything twice. So what we're going to do now is learn about modifiers. So the first thing I want to do is do a Control and R and place it so on the bottom edge or anywhere where it's going to create a vertical line. Now you could move it, but we want it slap bang in the middle. So I'm going to tap 0, left click to OK it, and we've got this new line of geometry going right down the middle. And now we'll need to turn our X-ray mode on, because what we're going to do, and just turn off our perspective, Alt and A to deselect everything. And now if I left click and drag, making sure that our selection box is selected for our left click function, you can see if we move our mouse there, it's selected all of those vertices. And just to show you, if X-ray mode wasn't on and I did the same thing in front of you, it would not select those back vertices. Okay, so we do want them all selected, so I'm just going to left click and drag, make sure they're all selected, and I'm going to do X, brings up our delete menu in edit mode as well, and we just want to delete vertices. And what we're left with is this sort of half shell of a man like me. Okay, just to turn off the X-ray mode so we can see that a little bit better. Okay, so now we've got a whole load of different menu items here, and each one has lots of things. But for now, we want to go to our modifier tab, which is this little spanner icon here. And again, got loads of really interesting modifiers that we'll one day want to work with. But for now, we just want to add a mirror modifier. And you can see what that does is it basically mirrors whatever we've got on the right, or if you'd done it the other way around on the left, it would create the mirror plane in the x-axis as default. So now if I were to grab one of these vertices, whatever I do on the right hand side is done on the left. Okay, so now we can think about adding our arms. So I've done a Control R loop cut just to create some geometry to extrude an arm. And tap to face select mode and select that face there, and E for extrude to make the arm. And similarly, we want some space for legs. We don't want them coming straight out from the middle, so I'm going to do another loop cut and face select mode, select that face there, and E for extrude, E for extrude, and E for extrude. And we've got a very basic body with feet. Hands, we'll have a quick look at hands. I mean, obviously, something like hands that are complex to sculpt anyway will take quite a lot of time to create decent looking hands, but just to give you a rough view of how you would approach it without going into too much detail, it's just about adding loop cuts and adjusting your geometry. So if I scale that in the z-axis so it's not quite so blocky, but I would then think about adding 3 loop cuts in this direction. Oh, and actually that's quite useful because I can also show you a different extrude function. So normally if we were just to extrude all of those 4 faces selected at the same time, it would just create one block. However, if I were to do Alt and E, I could do extrude individual faces. And it may look like they're all the same block, but if I were to go to individual origins and scale them, you can see they're 4 individual fingers. And I would do another loop cut, E for extrude, E for extrude, and maybe grab that in the z-axis. And you know, 3D modelling is all about fine-tuning. You can make something very rough in seconds, and then something a lot more detailed in hours or days. Okay, so you get the idea. Okay, so it's a very blocky character. Another useful modifier we're going to look at now is adding a subdivision surface modifier. So what that basically does is it smooths the geometric information. And if we go to the number of levels of the subdivision, if we up that, you can see it's going to get more and more smooth. And you've got two options here. One is how many levels of subdivision surface as we view it, but then also you may want it to be even smoother for when you render it, and you could up that on the render. And I would just say that you don't need to go much higher than 4, and your computer may well crash if you do. Okay, so I'm just going to give this a save just in case, and okay, so we've created this really rough figure, and like I say, it's all about fine-tuning. So if you actually wanted to spend a bit of time getting the proportions right, using all the techniques you've learned, you can. I'm just going to add a little bit of this and that. Grab in the x-axis. Oh, and a useful way of selecting a loop cut is to hold down Alt and left click, and that will click everything that exists in a loop. Alt and right click. Okay, so it's usually quite useful to keep your modifiers as they are. Once you okay them, you kind of can't go back, well, unless you saved a backup, etc. But for the purposes of what we're going to look at next, which is Sculpt mode, and just so you understand how the mirror modifier works. So actually we've got these different options here, and if I turn off this computer screen, it basically disables your modifier, so you can see what it looks like without it. So I'm just going to do that. For the mirror one, obviously, then we only see half of our object. And if I do that on the subdivision surface, you can see that is actually the geometric information we still have without the modifiers in action, so to speak. Okay, but then I'm just going to turn this down just so we don't have too much geometry for the purposes of the next exercise. And you can see what we can then think about doing is applying the modifiers. For some reason you can't do that in edit mode, so I'm just going to tap into object mode, and if I click on this little arrow and go to apply, you can see that the mirror modifier has been okayed, so it's made it real. And similarly in object mode, if I do the same, the subdivision surface, suddenly that blocky information has smoothed out and become real. And the next thing I want to look at is our Sculpt mode. So if I click on here at the top and select the Sculpt mode, you can see on the left here we've got loads of different sculpting tools, and if I drag out this edge of the menu, you can see we've got descriptions of what all of those things are. And a useful shortcut is you can change the radius of our brush and the strength, how powerful each of those functions are. If I tap F, you can see it changes the size of our brush, and draw can be quite useful. And if I were to hold down Control, it subtracts, and that's sort of true of a lot of these. You can have an experiment with all of these. The ones I tend to use the most are Draw, Smooth, Flatten sometimes, and Grab is quite useful. And I should also mention, you may want to sculpt symmetrically. So if I go to this menu option here, basically these are the settings for your tools, and scroll down to symmetry, and if I mirror in the x-axis, you can see whatever I do on one side, it does on the next. This sculpts the geometry, it doesn't add or take away more resolution. But if you want something with the functionality of ZBrush, ZBrush, depending on which side of the ocean you're on, what I'm going to do is, still within our tool settings, is turn on this thing here, which says DynTopo, which is short for dynamic topology. And basically what that means is it creates a much more organic sculpting experience, and you'll usually get this warning and I was just okay that. Now a lot of these tools become a lot more interesting, and basically what this means is if I zoom in, we have the kind of much more clay-like sculpting going on, and if I tab into edit mode, you can see it's actually added geometry. And then, yeah, just spend a bit of time experimenting with the different tools. Okay, I'm just going to undo a good few steps before any of the sculpting. Okay, probably quite useful actually. I don't think I've changed this since I've reinstalled Blender, but you do get to specify how many steps backwards your undo goes. So if you go to your edit preferences or control or command and comma and jump to system, you can see you can increase the amount of undo steps. And this may use more memory, but it's probably worth adding, I don't know, a few more than the 32, because you often need to go back several steps. Okay. Anyway, so that's a very quick look at Sculpt mode. I also want to share how to work with Boolean functions. Basically what that means is if you've got two objects, to merge them together or take away from each other or intersect. So I'm just going to, again, create a new file. And if I tap N, I've probably got more menu items here because I've installed various add-ons. There's a couple that I think you will need. So let's go over them both now, and then we'll look at them in turn. So again, if I go to Command or Control and comma, it brings up our preferences. And if we go to add-ons, the two that I think are very useful are Bool tool and the 3D print dialog. So if I type in Bool, you just need to select it and similarly 3D print the toolbox. So just tick that and it will install. You can also add various external add-ons, and they usually come as a zip folder, and you would just click on install and navigate to wherever the add-on you've downloaded is. But for now, we want 3D print toolbox and Bool tool. Okay, so the basic premise of Bool tool, so let's just say without it, if I were to add say a cone and I wanted to join these together, there is the option to merge them into one single object, but that's a Control and J. But if I go into X-ray mode, you can see that it hasn't actually, it's made them one object, but it hasn't sort of joined them together as a single solid object. So I could still Alt-A to deselect, I could L select, and you can see they're two separate meshes. So actually what we want to do is merge them so that they're a single object, which is sculpturally can be very useful, and I use it a lot. So let's just turn off the X-ray, and now with these two objects shift selected, if I go to the Bool tool is actually in this edit dialog here, and then if I click on Bool tool, what we've got there is we've got the auto and the brush. Basically what the brush does is it makes a modifier out of our Bool function, and auto just immediately okays it. So just so we can see what that looks like, if I wanted to merge these two, I'm with them both selected, I click on union. Now if I tab into edit mode, you can see that it's actually made them one solid object. And also useful, we've looked at X-ray, but showing overlays is a useful way to look at our objects with and without the orange outline that shows something is selected. Okay, so I'm going to leave that as it is, and let's say, just to show how the brush Boolean works, so if I add let's say a sphere and just move it somewhere like that, Now if I were to, with that selected and then shift select to this object, and instead of doing an auto Boolean I do a brush Boolean, you can see that that has added the sphere and it's merged it with this object here, but if we go to our modifier tab, it's actually done that as a modifier, meaning we can turn it off, disable it. It also means that we can click on this object and it still exists as its own object, and you could move that around. So there's a lot more flexibility, but there's different situations where you may want to use either one of those. And as before, we could OK that, and then this becomes defunct. Just to show, I'm just going to add a cylinder, and let's just move that there, and just to show the different functions, I'll just do auto Booleans for now. So with the cylinder selected first, and we want to take it away from that object, so I'm going to do difference auto Boolean, and you can see it works that out pretty nicely. And finally, the intersect. I've never used slice. I should look at slice, but I'll work that out later. Let's just do another cone. And intersect. And then intersect keeps the area where they overlap. And then finally, let's have a look at our 3D print dialog. Now this is just if you're 3D printing or sending your file for milling, you may often have errors in your file, and Blender's 3D print add-on has come quite a long way, and it's just quite a quick way of making sure your file is watertight for 3D printing or for milling. And what you can do is do a check all, and it will tell you about your mesh and where there are errors. Now a lot of the time some of these things don't really matter too much. Some matter more than others, but generally actually just clicking on make manifold will sort out a lot of your problems, and then you can export it into a 3D print friendly file format. And I should also mention you can also do that with any file in your export dialog here, and there's a whole load of other file formats, not just for 3D print or milling. Okay, just going to do a new file. I don't feel I can do an introduction to Blender without just touching upon some of the other things it can do. Animation, if you're interested in that, I'm just going to drop a little teaser of how to work with animation in Blender. I'm going to add a plane. Okay, so shift and right click to change the position of my 3D cursor, and I'm going to add a UV sphere. So if I tap I, we bring up our keyframe menu. So let's just do location, rotation and scale. So basically that's dropped a keyframe there in the timeline, and it's recorded this object's location, its rotation and its scale. Now if I jump to, let's just go to roughly 50, and I'm then going to grab this in the Z-axis, and let's have it so it's just touching the ground. I'm going to tap I and do another location, rotation, scale, and you can see what that's done is on this timeline here, if I just tap space, it will play, and then around here, I'm just going to do this very roughly by eye, add another keyframe, and I can even select this keyframe here, Shift and D to duplicate, and let's go grab in the Z-axis, and I can even exaggerate the animation, add another keyframe, and so on. Scale it in the Z-axis, add another keyframe, and there you've got the very basics of animation. might be the worst animation I've ever done. Okay. And as with everything, the more time you spend on it, the better it's going to be. Well, let's just press play. I've ever made. Okay, and so that's 0.01 of animating on Blender, but I thought it might be of interest to some of you. So now I'm going to add another sphere. I'm going to keep that plain, and I also want to quickly talk about the physics engine. So another way we could have animated this scene is using physics, and so what we're going to do with that is go to this physics tab here, the little Dr. Manhattan symbol, and I'm going to make this plane a collision object, and I'm going to make this ball a soft body, and I'm just going to press play, and not quite as easy as that. And we want to turn off the goal, and if we just press play, you can see the ball falls and interacts with that as a collision object. And I'm just going to turn on our viewport shading tab here. It's just a different way of looking at how the lighting is affecting everything. We can get a nice shadow in there. I'm going to turn the damping off. That's to see up to 10. Let's see how that goes. You can see it slows down as it's sort of figuring itself out. It's a lot of fine tuning we could do. You get the idea. Maybe you don't. Maybe you don't. Okay. Let's just do something slightly different. I'm just going to disable the soft body on the sphere. I'm just going to add a plane. I'm going to scale it in edit mode. I'm going to right click and subdivide. I'm going to add a load of cuts. And I'm going to set the ball as a collision object this time, and the plane as a cloth. Oh, and I'm just going to put us back at the beginning of the timeline, and yeah, there we go. Some very basic physics things, but really just to show you that it's in there and worth experimenting with if that's your bag. Add a bit more subdivision, and then I can make it look a little bit nicer by adding a subdivision surface modifier. Let's look at that again. Okay, so Control Shift and O to open our recent menu. I'm going to go to the car that we saved, and just to think about how we can add colour to our object and render our scene. And I'm just going to Shift and S. So we used cursor to select it before, but I'm going the cursor to world origin, so it's right in the middle. I'm going to let's add a couple of cylinders. Now if I add a mirror modifier to it, and then tab into edit mode and move the whole thing, you can see I'm going to get a mirrored cylinder. This is just to have a different object because the car we designed entirely as one object. Okay, so with our car selected, let's go to this materials tab. I'm going to add a new material. I'm going to just choose a shade of red. You can see nothing changes here. That's because we're in solid shading mode. So you would jump to one of these viewport shading options. This one imagines that you're in an environment where there are various presets, so it will sort of set the world as if it's being lit according to these different environments. I like to use the one that we've got more control over, so this is essentially using our light source. Okay, so this whole object has that one material, and if I add a new material for this cylinder, I'm just going to go for a dark red. Now, if we want more than one material in our object, I'm going to tab into edit mode. I'm going to add a new material. We can, using this little icon here, which has a list of all the different materials in your scene, you can see I've accidentally added another one mid-tutorial, but I'm going to add that material to this object, and now if I'm in face select mode, I can select various faces, click on this new material and assign it. So and then similarly I'm going to Alt-A, deselect everything, and I'm going to select the wheels, and I want to add a new material, which I can do while I'm in the object, and I'm going to add a grey and then assign it. And I'm just going, and a useful thing I've not shown you yet is you can expand on your selection. So with those two faces selected, if I do Control and plus, you can see it moves outward in its selection. So if I kept going, it would expand, which can be quite useful. And I'm just going to add another material. And I'm going to assign. And now to think about how we render our scene. That could be for still renders or video for animation. One of the keys we didn't look at on the Numpad was 0. And what that does is jump to camera mode. So that's this object here. If I tap on 0, you can see that it's defaulted to be at an angle looking at our default cube, which is why it kind of fits. I can grab the camera and move it. And it can be useful to have your transform controller selected. And you can also change your rotation while you're in the camera. So I've tapped 0 and I could rotate. Oh, my screencast keys are not on, I apologise. So yeah, so with the camera selected, I could rotate and move my camera using the different axes. And then you may want to render your model as an image, and go to render image. And then you can, to save, you go to this image menu, and then you can save your image as a JPEG or whatever. Okay, so that's it. A very brief introduction to Blender and some of the basic functions. I would recommend, the way I learned Blender was through searching for beginner tutorials on Blender. There's famously a donut tutorial where you make a donut with icing and sprinkles. But generally I would recommend finding a YouTuber who you like and run through more in-depth video tutorials for whatever aspects of 3D modelling or animation or sculpting you're interested in. Thanks, hope that was useful.